And with that, I want to introduce our special celebrity speaker tonight, Ivan Phillipsen, who is known to many of you as the creator and the host of the extremely popular Science of Birds podcast, which I've listened to many times, have enjoyed his lighthearted approach to difficult scientific concepts having to do with bird biology. And he describes it, I believe, as a lighthearted podcast for lifelong learners. And I really, really enjoy that. He also is a world field trip leader. So he guides with John. Let me see, what was the name of your partner? Steve Robertson, and he have a guiding company called Wild Latitudes, which is based in Portland, where Ivan also lives. So I hope he's going to tell us a little bit more about where they're going and the plans that they've got up, and certainly tell us more about tonight's topic, which would be the coloration of birds. So I am so pleased to introduce Ivan, and we have a big crowd of folks right now, and I think people will continue to dribble in. But take it away, Ivan. I'm so excited to have you. Welcome.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Matthew. I really appreciate the warm welcome. I am excited too, and this is going to be great. So hi, everybody. Thanks for being here on your Wednesday night. Hopefully it's a little cooler down there where you're at than where it is, how it is here. It's been pretty toasty. I don't know if you guys get enough of the coastal influence. We don't. So we are, let me share my screen. Let me get that going. I got all my many screens here. Give me just a sec. And so just, Matthew, you see that pop up?
I do indeed.
Okay, great. I'm just getting everything configured here, getting my little screens moved around. Okay. So, sorry. I literally have 4 monitors here that I'm playing with. So, so hopefully a number of you are familiar with the podcast, and if you're not, that's totally fine. I'll give you a little bit of a brief introduction to what my whole deal is. But yeah, tonight we're going to be talking about feather colors, and it's one of the really wonderful things about birds, right, that we're attracted to is their color. So as Matthew said, I have this tour company called Wild Latitudes that preceded the podcast. I started that back in 2017. Going back before that, I had a local tour business here in Portland, Oregon. I also did some work with the Portland Audubon Society, the formerly Portland Audubon Society. And then I got my PhD in zoology at Oregon State. And so I did science in the years before I became a guide and a podcaster. But hopefully my background in science kind of informs my what I'm doing with the podcast and with my guiding. And I think it does. And Wild Latitudes is really a wonderful thing to do. The business, we have tours all over the world. We do domestic tours. Right now, we have one running in Iceland. Later this year, I'll be heading to Vietnam. And early next year, I'll be going to Patagonia. So we go all over the place. And as I was telling Matthew, they're birding tours with a general natural history focus as well. We don't do a lot of hardcore birding. We try to keep it lighthearted and relaxed and enjoyable. That seems to work pretty well. People seem to like what we do and come back again and again. So it's a lot of fun. And the podcast is something that I started about 4 years ago. I'm actually, as of tomorrow, I have 100 episodes. That episode is coming out tomorrow, which is pretty exciting. So it's been a pretty great ride. Lots of people listening around the world. I get lots of great feedback. So it's been really a real joy to create the podcast. And I learn a lot too. I learn every time I make a podcast episode, I learn a lot about the biology of birds. And that was one of the motivations for doing that, was to step up my game, right? As a guide, as just a naturalist in life, I want to know more about birds. I always want to learn because I too am a lifelong learner. So the podcast kind of forces me to do that, which is pretty awesome. Okay, so I always like to start kind of with the basics, and this is going to be review for pretty much all of us, just some very basic stuff that's just kind of fun to think about, kind of almost like philosophical, but like, what is color, right? We look around right now, there's many colors around us, and we just kind of take it for granted that those objects, those things out there, they are that color, right? It's something intrinsic about those objects. It's fundamental to those things. But again, this is review. I know you know this, but really it's in the eye of the beholder, right? Colors can be perceived differently by different individuals and by different species, or not perceived at all, right? If you can't see color, you might just see values of black, white, and gray. So there's really no sort of absolute in terms of what colors are. It's just perception. But humans, we have really good color vision. We seem to be very attracted to colorful things, and from an evolutionary psychology perspective, that may be because of things being attracted to things like fruits and vegetables, certain types of food, certain types of environments. Who knows? Certainly kids are attracted to colors, and people who make toys have figured that out, and cereal boxes and all that kind of stuff. But hey, birders like color too, and I am definitely one of them. I am crazy about colorful birds, which is why this family of birds, the neotropical tanagers, the birds in the family Thraubidae, are absolutely amazing. It's one of the most species-rich bird families in the world, with something like 300 plus species, rivaling hummingbirds in diversity. Really just an amazing group of birds. And, you know, it's the variety of colors that make them so interesting. Of course, they have interesting behaviors and ecologies and all that too, but we are just amazed by their colors, right? So tonight what we're talking about is how do they look like that? How does that happen? So it all starts with light, right? And for us, it starts with sunlight, light from our nearest star. And this emits electromagnetic radiation at all these different wavelengths. And we can look at a very sort of textbook sort of illustration of those wavelengths in nanometers. And there are lots of wavelengths coming out of the sun, but we cannot see all of them, right? We evolved to perceive only some of those wavelengths, and that is the visible spectrum, the rainbow, right? Roy G. Biv. And so that's what we see there. And it's a pretty narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum, but it works well enough for us. It got us this far. We seem to be doing okay. Now, just as a reminder, when you combine all of the colors of rainbow and you beam that into your eye, you perceive that as white light, which is what, again, we're getting from the sun. Typically, we think of sunlight as being pretty much white. And when something absorbs all of those wavelengths, all of the colors of the rainbow, we get black, or something that, or just something that cannot reflect that is black, just as a reminder. Just kind of interesting. So in our eyes, in our retinas, at the back of our eyeballs on the inside, we have different photoreceptor cells, cells that respond to light. We have rods, which are the ones that respond to more like black and white, to values, but the cone cells are the ones that respond to color. And we have 3 different kinds of cone cells, and it's the combination of those cells firing and sending nerve impulses to our brain that allow us to interpret what we're seeing in terms of wavelength as color. So that's humans. And again, we've got pretty good vision, but birds have 4 cone cells. This is a steppe eagle, right? And eagles and hawks, raptors are known for having really good vision. And they have, of course, they have a high density of rods and cones, and that gives them really fine sort of discrimination in their vision. But all birds have 4 cone cells, and that gives them the ability to see more colors, to put it simply, just colors that we can't even imagine, because they actually have some cone cells, or one particular cone cell, the 4th one, that is receptive to ultraviolet wavelengths, and we cannot see that. So this is here is highlighted in pink on this slide, and those wavelengths are smaller wavelengths than the typical visible spectrum. So what does that mean? It means birds have a broader spectrum of colors that they can see from the electromagnetic spectrum, which is pretty cool. And that comes into play in things like this, where we have Atlantic puffins on the left, they're kind of nuzzling each other. That's very cute. But if you look down the lower left, you see that the rhamphotheca of an Atlantic puffin, right? That's the sheath, the keratin sheath of the bill, is illuminating in the ultraviolet, right? It's glowing in the ultraviolet end of the spectrum. So those birds, that's more like what they're seeing. When they look at each other, they see even more vibrant colors than what we see when we see them. And they're pretty impressive even just to us, right? So, and that may be some kind of signaling between individuals. We don't know exactly, but that's pretty cool. And then on the right, we have a northern saw-whet owl. And this is pretty cool that people banding these owls have figured out that if you shine ultraviolet light or black light on their wings, they fluoresce in the UV, and you can, just some of the feathers do, and it actually tells you something about the molt of the feathers. And what the function of this is, I'm not sure if anybody knows yet, but they do fluoresce in UV light, which is pretty cool. So there's a lot more going on than meets the eye, at least our eyes anyway, right? Okay, so we've talked about kind of what color is and how it plays out, and how birds perceive color differently than we do. So what are the functions? There are several different functions of why birds have color. Sort of obvious one is predator avoidance, right? Not all birds are colorful like the tanagers or the hummingbirds. Many of them are more drab and they're more cryptically colored, right? Or they have cryptic plumage, like this tawny frogmouth here from Australia. These are the kind of birds that, they just close their eyes and they suddenly become part of the tree. It's an amazing camouflage. And then we have things like shorebirds that nest in the tundra and the Arctic, right? They have those mottled backs with spots and barring, and they too can disappear into that landscape, and they kind of just drop down, or if they're sitting on the nest, because there aren't many trees or places to hide, they need to have cryptic plumage. So that's a whimbrel there in Alaska. And then we have, this is a little penguin, sometimes called little blue penguins. We have something called counter shading. And this is a common phenomenon, especially in marine animals, but also in terrestrial animals, where the back is a lot darker than the belly or the underside. And the idea for marine animals is especially obvious. If you're swimming around, if you're a predator and you're looking down on this penguin, well, the penguin is going to be hard to see against the darkness of the depths, right? It's going to kind of disappear. But if you're a predator underneath the penguin and you're looking up, that white belly might sort of blend in with the lighter sky that's above the water there, that's shining, the light that's shining through the water. So many, marine creatures, think about like killer whales and sharks, they have this counter shading. And that's for predator avoidance as well. Then we have species recognition. This one's really interesting because we have many bird species that where both male and female are similarly colored, right? And yet they're very brightly colored and vibrantly colored. So typically we might think of birds having colorful plumage as a sort of sexual selection or sexual attraction for members of the opposite sex. Well, what if they both look the same? Then that wouldn't be the true, right? So the way I imagine this operating, and of course we don't know necessarily without scientific study, is that this is a way, this is species recognition. So if you have a kingfisher that's in a sort of dark forest and it has bright plumage like this, sure, it's going to be more conspicuous to predators. It's not cryptic, but it's going to stand out to other kingfishers, either rivals or potential mates that can quickly realize, hey, that's one of my people. I'm going to go over there and make friends, right? So it's purely species recognition. I get that question. Some people ask me, like, why do they look so colorful? And, why would they want to stand out like that? And if it's not for sexual selection, this is my interpretation. And, somebody who's a real ornithologist could maybe take me to task on that. And then we have age class recognition. So we have an adult brown pelican in breeding plumage. And if you look at the juveniles or the immature birds, they have more just of that uniform brown head. So birds can often quickly tell which members of their species are sexually mature. And that's similar to species recognition. You don't want to waste your time with somebody who isn't able to make babies with you if that's your main mission in life, which is to breed, which most of the time it is. Stay alive long enough to pass some genes on, right? So you don't want to waste your time with the immature individuals. So age class recognition. There's the juveniles there. I didn't realize, yeah, they're on the left, out of focus a little bit, but very different looking than the adults. So you can quickly decide who's what age. And then of course, sex recognition. Like in these mandarin ducks here, many ducks do have that sexual dimorphism or dichromatism where the males and females are differently colored. Typically, the male is more colorful. Not always. There are definitely exceptions to that. And this is something we've learned about again and again. That's a topic for another day, but sex recognition is a big reason why many species seem to be so brightly colored. But returning to this idea of these monochromatic species, right, where males and females, like this northern mockingbird, look pretty much the same, at least to our eyes, right? So you think, well, how do they tell each other apart from male and female? What are they basing that on? Maybe it's vocalizations, maybe it's behavior, but in species like this, for example, scientists have discovered that, and I think it's the males have a bright reflective patch. That's just a fake thing I put on there. But this is kind of imagining what another mockingbird might see. Because they can see in the UV wavelengths, mockingbirds can see that I'm trying to remember if it's the male or not. I can't remember. No, I think it's the males that have this bright patch that only in the UV end of the spectrum. So again, there's more going on than what we can see. And so we always need to be humble and realize there's more information out there than our little human eyes and brains can handle. And then, sexual display and attraction. So of course, this is, returning to this idea of, sexual selection, right? So here we have a tufted coquette from Trinidad and Tobago, a little hummingbird with amazing plumage. That's just the male that has that gorget and the crest and all that good stuff, the stuff that we love. The female doesn't look anything like that. So that's, again, for sexual attraction. Okay, so those were the functions. Now we're going to get into just the very basics of feather structure. I did do a whole podcast episode on this. This is a fun thing to learn. Many of you probably know a lot of this stuff because you guys are serious bird nerds. So again, it's just review. So a typical feather has what we call the shaft or the rachis, that central vein. And then branching off of that, we have barbs. So those are the first sort of branching structures. And then if we zoom in at an even smaller microscopic structure, we have the barbules. And the barbules on a typical contour feather or flight feather, they hook together with little hooks, and so that they maintain the structure of that feather vein. So very basics of feather structure, but somewhat relevant to what we're talking about today. Okay, now we're getting into the real stuff. So, painted bunting, right? Totally ridiculous bird. How does this happen? This is just out of control, right? Beautiful, amazing male painted bunting. Well, with feather colors, there are two primary mechanisms. These are the overarching ways that feather can get their color. And they're not mutually exclusive, and we'll talk about that later. So there's pigment and there's structure. And first we're going to talk about pigments. Pigment is, at least to me, and I assume maybe for you guys, a bit more intuitive. It's like, okay, you got this thing, you got this powder or this liquid, this chemical that has a color, and you put it in something else and it gives that, it imparts that color to that other thing, right? It's kind of intuitive. But the way pigments are working at a microscopic level is that you have these different wavelengths of light coming in of different colors, and they hit the pigment, and the pigment could be, it's some kind of molecule typically at the very microscopic level. And that molecule absorbs certain wavelengths, and it does not absorb, or it re-emits other wavelengths, right? So in this case, blue, green, and red come in, but only blue is reflected back. So that's how a pigment works. Very basic, but it's the color that does not get absorbed is what we're seeing, right? So when you see green leaves, leaves absorb everything except for green. Chlorophyll does that, right? So when we have something like a northern cardinal that's red, there are pigments in the plumage of this bird. And if we look at the microscopic feather structure, say this kind of rectangle here, this 3D rectangle, is us taking a little slice of the surface of the feather, maybe of the barbs, let's say. And so the outer surface is a keratin cortex. That's that kind of clear glass-looking surface there. And then below that, just below the surface, we have pigment granules. So sunlight shines through the transparent keratin. It might be modified a little bit, can be, hits the pigments. Everything except for red gets absorbed. Red bounces back out. We see a red bird. Pretty basic, pretty easy to understand. One of the main kinds of pigments we have, there are two major classes. The first kind is melanins, right? And melanin is what is in human skin and mammals, right? So what gives us our different skin tones, hair colors. These are melanins, and this is the kind of molecular structure of one example of melanin. Birds, like us, can make their own melanins, and that's a key distinction because we're going to be talking about other pigments that birds can't make on their own, but they can make melanin. And there are two major forms of melanin. There's eumelanin, meaning kind of like true melanin. When you see the letters EU, usually that means kind of like true. Eumelanin, which gives us things like black, gray, and brown. And then pheomelanin, which gives us more like the yellows and oranges, kind of ochre colors. Maybe not super bright, but kind of more in the brown end of the spectrum, reddish brown. Okay, so we've got melanin is one type of pigment, a class of pigments, and then within that there's even two subcategories. So in a bird and in us as well, there are specialized cells called melanocytes that make melanin. And this is an image of human melanocytes. And then we have a diagram of a melanocyte. You've got the cell body there with these kind of tentacles called dendrites. And what a melanocyte does is it's making the melanin and then it's packaging them into these little bubble-like structures called melanosomes. That's that red rectangle there. That's the word melanosome on the left. And those then can get exported from the melanocyte out into whatever structure the melanin is heading for, right? So those melanin granules are exported from the melanocyte in a melanosome. Lots of terminology here, I understand. But so here we've got this little matrix. Don't worry about the molecular structures. I am going to ask you to draw these at the end. You're going to have to memorize these, but just ignore those for the moment. So we have melanin and we have the melanosomes. We have actual images on the right of what those little bundles of melanin look like. And on the top, those are eumelanosomes. So the ones that they have within them, they have eumelanin, and then at the bottom you have pheomelanosomes, and those have pheomelanins. So they have a different sort of look and different structure. That's all this is really trying to show you. And no, you don't have to memorize the molecular structure. I certainly haven't. So birds do all kinds of amazing things with the melanin in their feathers. There's variation on the body. Of course, we saw lots of pictures already of birds with feathers in different parts of their body expressing melanin in different ways. So that's sort of at the macro level of how expression can differ in a bird's body. But then even within a feather, there's all this variation. That's kind of what we're seeing here. We're seeing not just variation across the body, but also the amazing patterns that melanin can be laid down as a feather is growing, giving us these bars and spots and all kinds of wacky stuff. And so it's where all the patterns come from in birds, not just their colors, but the beautiful patterns that we love. Like, for example, these are the feathers of the great argus, which is a type of pheasant. It has these amazing, ridiculous feathers. I mean, we're just seeing a few feathers zoomed in. Those white lines are the shafts or the rachis, and you have the barbs coming out with these phenomenal patterns, pretty much formed entirely from melanin. This is pretty cool. So this is a fossil feather from about 100 million years ago. This was found in Brazil. Yeah. And the black marks there are melanin. So they are the fossilized, preserved melanocytes, or I should say melanosomes, or melanin granules, forgive me, laid down in the feather. Originally, when paleontologists first looked at some of these prehistoric or these fossilized bird feathers, they found these black patches and they misinterpreted them. They thought they were fossilized bacteria. But much more recent research in the last couple decades, paleontologists, scientists have figured it out. These in fact are telling us what the feathers were colored like in life, which is really cool. So that brings us to this fossil, which is Anchiornis huxleyi. That's the name of the species. And it lived about 160 million years ago, and I believe it was discovered in China, as so many of these amazing feathered dinosaurs have been in recent decades. So Anchiornis, this fossil has, and here, let's see, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the skull is up there in the kind of upper left. The legs are out to the right. The tail comes up to the upper right. Kind of like Archaeopteryx, little small bird, but I'm going to show you the artist's recreation of this bird, right? Now, Typically, back in the day, when an artist recreated a prehistoric animal, they would just have to take wild guesses at what the colors might be. But in this case, because of that fossil, because it preserves the melanin, not just the eumelanin, but the pheomelanins in the head. So there actually were evidence of there being a black and red head crest. So colored almost like a pileated woodpecker or something. So really, this was just an amazing discovery, and more have come out since. But this is one of the sort of most remarkable ones. Pretty amazing. Okay, so we're still talking about pigments. We talked about melanins. Now we're going to talk about the other major class of pigments, and those are the carotenoids. Easy to remember because it sounds like carrots, got the word carrot in there, and these typically are orange and yellow and red, so very much like carrots, and carrots do in fact have carotenoids. But a key distinction is that birds do not make their own carotenoids in their bodies. They just don't have the cellular machinery to do that for some reason. So they have to get their carotenoids from somewhere else. So here again, another molecular structure. Always exciting to look at this. If you're into chemistry, that's good for you. So an oriole, right? This is where the rubber hits the road with these carotenoids. We get amazing colors like this. Now the black, that comes from the melanin, but the orange, that is the result of these carotenoids being incorporated into the feathers, which is pretty remarkable. Quite famously, flamingos, the color of these guys, are also, this comes from these carotenoids, and they get their carotenoids from their diet, these little microscopic organisms that they're eating, and the carotenoids, the ultimate source of those, I believe, if I recall correctly, is algae, and then there are these small crustaceans that eat the algae, incorporating the carotenoids into their bodies, and then the flamingos eat the crustaceans, and then eventually the carotenoids end up in the flamingo. And the flamingos go so far as to actually use secretions from their preen gland that are rich in these carotenoids. They get that oil, that's just pink oil essentially, get it with their bill and rub it all over their feathers, basically using it as a cosmetic, right, to make themselves look even more pink than their feathers are naturally. They're trying to glam it up, and they're using those carotenoids from their preen gland, which is pretty amazing. And then we have our nice little house finch here, nice male house finch. And there's been a lot of research on these guys, and they too get that red color from their diet. So plants typically, so when you think of carotenoids, it's typically things like algae or plants of some kind that are producing carotenoids, and then they make their way through the food chain from one creature to another. Now, in the case of the finches, they're eating seeds, plants that have those carotenoids, and incorporating them into their feathers. The original idea among ornithologists, or one major hypothesis, is that by incorporating these carotenoids, the male is advertising, look, I can find food. I'm really good at finding food. I'm healthy. I'm fit. Look how red I am. He's advertising that to potential mates. The mates can see that red color. And so that's a great hypothesis. I guess there's some pushback against that now, or there's alternative hypotheses. Not sure I quite understand them, but things are almost always more complex than we think that they are. But it's still a reasonable way to think about this, is that these birds, like the flamingos, they're using those carotenoids in one of those functions that we talked about earlier, usually in something like species recognition or a sort of sexual attraction. And speaking of sexual attraction, so here we have this crimson-backed tanager. It's the male. And just a couple years ago, this research came out. It's pretty interesting. So the males are much more richly colored than the females. They have these colors that ornithologists describe as super black and velvet red. The black is just extra black, and the red is just this kind of amazing rich color. But when they look at the feathers of both males and females, they find that the actual carotenoids are the same in both males and females. So the males don't actually have any more, or they're not, it's not more dense in the feathers or something. What the males are actually doing, not consciously, but through evolution, they have this microscopic structure in their feathers that changes the light and the way the light interacts with those pigments, giving that richer color, that super black and that velvet red. And if we can assume that the male's color is an advertisement of his fitness, of his ability to get food and raise a family maybe, then he's kind of cheating, because He has the exact same amount of carotenoids as the female, but he's got this special microscopic structure in his feathers that make him look like he's getting more food than he is, or brighter than he is. It's really it's kind of this, they call it this this example of, what do you want to dishonest signaling. It's a dishonest signal to other birds, to the females, which is pretty wild. But hey, whatever works. Okay, so we've talked about melanins, we've talked about carotenoids. There are still some more rare pigments that show up in the avian world, which are pretty cool. Okay, so this is a turaco. This is a Nasna turaco, really a phenomenally beautiful bird, pretty wild looking. Turacos make a couple different pigments that are unique to turacos. I think they might show up in a couple other groups of birds, but they actually make these pigments, and they're called, in the case of the green, this beautiful rich green is a turacoverdin, right? So that's one of the few actual green pigments in birds, because typically greens come from a combination of yellow mixed with some blue, and we're going to talk about blue in a moment. But turacoverdin is actually produced by the bird and incorporated into the feathers. Pretty amazing. So these are types of porphyrins. Porphyrins is this other category. Okay, so turacoverdin is one porphyrin, and another porphyrin is turacin. So within this same family of birds, the turacos, there's this rich crimson red, which is from turacin. And again, the birds are making these, which is pretty cool. Parrots, too, actually make some of their own pigments. Psittacofulvins give them some color. And again, it's not from their diet. They make their own pigments. So that's probably explains some of the really, really rich colors of parrots, which is pretty cool. The last type of pigments we have are the sphenicins. And if you recall, the name of the family of penguins is Sphenicidae. And that yellow that you see on these guys, these emperor penguins, those are sphenicins. So again, they produce these in their bodies, incorporate them into their feathers. So that's one of these kind of more rare pigments you see in the avian world, are sphenicins. And then biliverdin actually is quite common, but it's not something we see in the feathers or in the skin. It's in the eggs. So biliverdin comes from the breakdown of hemoglobin in the body, and the female deposits this pigment onto the eggs in many species. That's where that rich blue comes from. It's from biliverdin. And of course, we're not just talking about feathers. I know that's the topic today, but the birds use this in their skin as well, right? So they use, typically they're going to use pigments in their skin, but there also may be some structural color, which is what we're getting to right now. Okay, so we've been talking about pigments. Again, that's kind of more intuitive. Structural color is really cool, but it's a little less intuitive to understand. So we'll see what we can do here. So we've got some nice white terns, beautiful little elegant birds. And white is a type of structural color. It's probably the most common one that many of us experience on a daily basis. And what we're seeing is every color of the visible spectrum being refracted in the feathers of these birds. And so there's the white, the sunlight goes into the feathers, and there are microscopic bubbles made out of keratin, right? So feathers are made of keratin, the same stuff, similar stuff to our fingernails. Beta keratin is unique to birds, but at the microscopic level, within the feathers of birds like these white terns, there are these little bubbles that are kind of randomly distributed inside the feather, and that causes light to just bounce around in all kinds of directions, and it comes back out to meet our eye, and we interpret it as white. So white is a type of structural color, and that phenomenon is called incoherent scattering. The sunlight is scattered incoherently, and we perceive it as white. And then, of course, we have iridescence, like we see here in the peacock. Iridescence is perhaps the most famous of the different kinds of structural colors. So that's this whole section now we're talking about structural color. So we have a very sciencey little diagram here. So we're going to zoom in on our feather. We're going to be looking just at a cross section of a barbule. That's what that oval shape there is on the bottom. Okay, so we're way down at the microscopic level on the feather. And what we're seeing is rows of these little melanosomes. Do you remember melanosomes? Those came out of the melanocytes, which were the special cells that produce melanin. Those created those little bundles of melanin. Those are called melanosomes. And those get deposited in these layers within the barbules of a bird with iridescent feathers. This is just one way of doing it. It's a very small scale, but they're in these layers, and in between the layers often are sandwiched layers of keratin, these kind of translucent layers of keratin. Melanosomes are dark, they absorb light, whereas the keratin can transmit light. And here's an actual image of a cross-section of one of those barbules, and you can see the distribution of those melanosomes in layer after layer in this kind of laminar structure. It's pretty wild. Okay, so what's happening sort of diagrammatically, right? So imagine now you've got a hummingbird and we've zoomed way in. We're looking at one of the tiny, tiny, tiny barbules on one of those iridescent feathers, and we're seeing just the surface of it. And you can see how there are 3 different layers of keratin. That's that clear kind of translucent stuff. And then in between are these rodules, they're calling them, these rods of melanin. And so what's happening is the white light is coming in, it's passing through all of those layers, and at each layer, some of the light might be getting absorbed, some is going to be reflected, but because there are different layers, the wavelengths that come back out, they are coming back out at different angles. And that's important. That's what this diagram is showing you, those 3 different eyeballs at the top. The eyes are different colors because that's what those eyes are seeing because of the angle of the viewing angle of the feathers. That's why when a bird turns, an iridescent bird moves, then we see different color. Okay, so interestingly, there's more than one way to be iridescent. Birds have figured this out through evolution. There are the different groups of birds independently evolved to be iridescent, and they, if you look at their barbule structure at the microscopic level, they did it in different ways. So on the left there, we have a brown-headed cowbird. Maybe you don't think of a cowbird as being iridescent, but take a look at that really shiny brown head. That is a type of iridescence or structural color. So there's these thick rods, thick melanosome rods in the cowbird. And then you have the Nicobar pigeon, which is a phenomenally beautiful iridescent bird, has thin rods. The trogon there has hollow rods, and so on and so forth, right? The different ways of achieving the same thing. Maybe this is obvious, but I didn't really point it out very clearly in the beginning. Structural color comes from the way that light interacts with the microscopic structure of the feather. It doesn't have to do so much with pigment. I mean, there is an interaction with melanin, but the color we're seeing is not from the pigment. It's from the wavelengths that are being sort of interfered with by the microscopic structure. That's why it's called structural color. Okay, let's see. Oops. Let's see. I changed my... Give me just a sec. I zoomed in accidentally somehow. How did I do that? Okay, there we go. Okay. So now again, we can look at some real images of these melanosomes in different groups of birds and just see the point is here is just that they are different and that birds independently evolved the ability to be iridescent. It must have some important function for these birds, like this Anna's hummingbird. There's a male, we've all probably experienced this, where you're trying to get a photo of the hummingbird and you want it to see its beautiful colors, and the dang bird just won't look at you. It won't turn its head just the right angle. But then when it does, bang, you get that really amazing flash of iridescent color from the gorget and the head of the bird. Really amazing, but it's all about the viewing angle, right? So just another couple examples of amazing iridescence. We have the great sapphire wing. I mean, hummingbirds have just endless examples of incredible iridescence. The red-billed streamer tail. No, sorry, this one's, I believe this is in Jamaica. It's certainly in the Caribbean, I think in Jamaica. Violet-backed starling. I love purple birds. Purple is just a pretty wild color to see on a bird, and so this again is coming from structural color. One of the most amazingly iridescent birds, or a group of birds I should say, are the monals of the mostly in the Himalayas, and the Himalayan monal being a great example. Just this rainbow of ridiculous iridescent color, just absolutely amazing. I've never seen one of these in real life. I'm hoping to someday. Maybe some of you guys have. And then there are more sort of mundane levels of iridescence all around us. I mean, ravens have iridescence. These are raven feathers, and you can see there's a bit of a kind of a bluish, oily sheen there in the feathers. So it's a bit more common than maybe we realize. Okay, so we have within structural color, there's white, right, which comes from incoherent scattering. Then we just talked about iridescence, which has to do with all those layers of keratin sandwiched between layers of melanin. And then we have non-iridescent structural color. And this is where we get things like our typical blues, blue colors that are not really iridescent, but they are structural, because there aren't really, birds don't really have pigments that give blue. Blue it's purely coming from structure. And so now we get this nice diagram where the white light is coming through from the sun, passing through the translucent keratin. It hits this spongy layer, they're calling it, spongy layer of keratin with these kind of bubbles that are microscopic, that are causing the light to get refracted. Then below all that, there is a black layer of melanin. And so that absorbs light. It absorbs everything except for blue. So blue escapes because it bounces off that spongy layer, but the other colors get absorbed, and so we perceive that as blue. So in things like the male and female mountain bluebird, and I'm sure you've had this experience too, where something like a Steller's jay or a mountain bluebird it looks almost brown or gray from a certain angle, and then it changes its angle, or you change your angle, and suddenly that blue is just out of sight. It's just amazing. So it's really, again, it's something that exists in our mind. It's not something that's absolute. It all depends on the angle you're seeing it at, and it's pretty remarkable. And then another great example of structural colors, the Indian roller. Rollers are really beautiful birds in Asia and Europe. Okay, so we've got pigments, we've got structure, and within those there's all kinds of subcategories, but we can now bring these together. Many birds do this. They bring both pigments and structure together to get their colors, right? So we're going to combine them now in something like a budgie, right? The classic pet store budgie. These guys are using all of the tools. They have pigments, so they have carotenoids in their feathers, but they have structural color like the blues, and that's where the green comes from. So the green is actually a combination of blue structural color combined with yellow carotenoids, and that gives us the green. And if you look at, I don't have a picture here, but there are all these different breeds or varieties of budgies, and they have different genetic mutations, so you can get white ones, yellow ones, blue ones, green ones, and it all has to do with the genes that are turning on and off the ability to either incorporate carotenoids or the ability to have structural color, or it's all over the place, but you can get all of the variations. So it's really kind of a textbook classic case to demonstrate this. And then we have something like the green-headed tanager, again from that neotropical tanager family, doing a similar thing where you've got this kind of beautiful blue feathers on the head, but then on the neck and in the wings and sides, you have that lime green, that just chartreuse color. And the only difference there is that there are carotenoids in the more green feathers, whereas otherwise the structure is probably very similar. You just throw in some carotenoids and boom, now you've got that bright yellow-green. And that, I guess, miraculously, is what I've got. So, I think we'll certainly do questions, but just to kind of review, because I hope this is pretty straightforward. But again, you've got these two big categories of pigment and structure, and then within pigment you have melanins and you have carotenoids, and then you can break those down even further, right? Melanins, there's eumelanins and there's pheomelanins, and then in the carotenoids, same thing. And then structural color, you have white, which is one kind, you have iridescence, and then you have this non-iridescent structural color like blue, and then you have the combination of all of them. So that's just kind of a whirlwind of how birds get their feather colors, but hopefully that made sense. And yeah.